Mars is our neighbour right here in the solar system, a red world that seems to be just over there. We have already sent robots and rovers to explore its dusty surface. But here is the truth that few people tell. Going there is perhaps the most dangerous thing a human being can try to do. The title of this video suggests that 99% of people would die in this attempt. Why is this number so high? What exists in the emptiness between Earth and Mars that is so deadly? And why is the simple act of landing there almost impossible? Prepare to fall asleep while listening to this video as we discover together the hidden dangers of this incredible journey. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and comment which part of the world you are watching from. Get comfortable and relax. Let's begin. Have you ever wondered why we haven't sent humans to Mars yet? Despite all the technological advances and billions of dollars invested in space exploration, there's a silent killer that awaits astronauts on their journey to the red planet: space radiation. This invisible threat represents one of the most significant obstacles to human exploration of Mars and explains why the journey could be fatal for most who attempt it. Space radiation is fundamentally different from radiation we experience on Earth. Our planet protects us with a powerful magnetic field and thick atmosphere that shields us from the constant bombardment of cosmic rays and solar radiation. Once astronauts leave this protective bubble, they become exposed to radiation levels that the human body simply isn't designed to handle. During a typical Mars mission lasting about 3 years round trip, astronauts would be exposed to radiation equivalent to approximately 1,000 times that of a chest X-ray. This isn't a one-time exposure, but a constant bombardment that damages cells continuously throughout the journey. The DNA in astronauts' cells would suffer constant damage during transit, significantly increasing their risk of developing cancer and degenerative diseases later in life. What makes cosmic radiation particularly dangerous is that it consists of high-energy particles that can penetrate spacecraft walls. Even more concerning, when these particles hit the spacecraft structure, they can create secondary radiation that's potentially more harmful than the original radiation itself. It's like being hit not just by the bullet, but also by dangerous fragments that scatter after the bullet hits a surface. Current shielding technology falls woefully short of solving this problem. The physics of radiation protection presents a challenging dilemma. Effective shields need to be incredibly thick and heavy, but every kilogram added to a spacecraft requires more fuel and larger launch vehicles, dramatically increasing mission costs. Even with our best current shielding technologies, astronauts on a Mars mission would receive radiation doses exceeding what's considered safe for their entire career as an astronaut. Engineers are exploring innovative solutions like water shields or magnetic fields around spacecraft, but these technologies remain theoretical or in early development stages. Solar radiation presents another deadly threat. While cosmic rays provide a constant background radiation, the sun occasionally releases intense solar flares and coronal mass ejections that can deliver potentially lethal radiation doses within hours. During these solar events, astronauts would need to shelter in specially protected areas of the spacecraft. Missing the warning signs of an impending solar event by even a few hours could result in acute radiation sickness or death. Unlike Earth-orbiting astronauts who can return home quickly in emergencies, Mars-bound travelers would be committed to their journey with no possibility of emergency evacuation. The radiation threat doesn't end upon arrival at Mars either. The red planet lacks both a strong magnetic field and thick atmosphere, leaving its surface exposed to about 2/3 of the radiation experienced in deep space. Any long-term settlement would require habitats built underground or with substantial shielding overhead. Surface activities would need to be limited and carefully timed to minimize exposure. Astronauts would need radiation detectors integrated into their suits and habitats, constantly monitoring their cumulative dose. The human body does have some ability to repair radiation damage, but this capacity becomes overwhelmed by the constant bombardment experienced during deep space travel. Over time, this leads to cellular damage that can manifest as increased cancer risk, cognitive impairment, cardiovascular problems, and immune system dysfunction. Studies on astronauts who spent extended periods on the International Space Station already show concerning health changes, and they were still protected by Earth's magnetic field. The radiation exposure on a Mars mission would be substantially higher. Radiation also damages electronics, potentially compromising critical spacecraft systems. Computers may experience random errors or complete failures. Life support systems could malfunction, and communication equipment might become unreliable. Engineers design space systems with radiation hardening and redundancy, but the extended duration of a Mars mission pushes these protections to their limits. A single critical system failure caused by radiation could doom the entire mission. Research continues into biological countermeasures that might help protect astronauts, from radioprotective drugs to genetic therapies designed to improve cellular repair mechanisms. Some scientists have even proposed controversial approaches, like intentionally exposing astronaut candidates to low radiation doses to stimulate adaptive responses before the mission. However, all these approaches remain experimental, and none offers complete protection against the radiation hazards of deep space. The radiation problem perfectly illustrates why Mars exploration represents such an enormous challenge. It's not just about building bigger rockets or better life support systems. It's about overcoming fundamental physics problems that have no easy engineering solutions. Until we develop dramatically better radiation protection technologies, sending humans to Mars means knowingly exposing them to radiation levels that will significantly increase their risk of cancer and other radiation-induced diseases. This sobering reality explains why robotic missions currently remain our primary means of exploring the Red Planet, with human missions still firmly in the realm of future possibilities rather than current capabilities. Psychological effects of isolation. Imagine being confined to a space no larger than a modest apartment for 3 entire years, sharing this cramped environment with the same handful of people day after day, while the familiar blue Earth shrinks to a mere dot in the vastness of space. This psychological reality of a Mars mission represents a human challenge potentially more difficult to overcome than even the technical hurdles of getting there. The psychological effects of prolonged isolation and confinement during a Mars mission would test human mental resilience in ways never before experienced. A typical mission would require astronauts to live in extremely cramped quarters for approximately 3 years, about 8 months travelling to Mars, a year and a half on the surface, and another 8 months returning to Earth. Throughout this entire period, crew members would have virtually no personal space, no opportunity to feel fresh air or experience nature, and no possibility of emergency return if the psychological strain becomes unbearable. This extended isolation creates the perfect conditions for serious psychological deterioration. Studies of personnel at Antarctic research stations, submarine crews, and simulation experiments like Russia's Mars 500 program have consistently shown how extended isolation affects human psychology. After about 6 months in confined isolation, many participants begin showing signs of depression, irritability, insomnia, and cognitive decline. Concentration becomes difficult, memory problems emerge, and decision-making abilities suffer. For a Mars mission, these effects would begin manifesting just as the crew reaches the midpoint of their journey to Mars, with 2.5 more years of mission still ahead. The interpersonal dynamics in such confined quarters create another layer of psychological challenge. Minor annoying habits can transform into major sources of conflict when there's no escape from them. Cultural differences in communication styles, personal hygiene practices, or work ethics that might be easily accommodated in normal circumstances can become flashpoints for serious crew conflict. Studies of isolated teams consistently show that social tensions tend to increase over time, not decrease, as the psychological pressure of confinement builds. The constant awareness that any system failure could mean certain death adds enormous psychological weight. astronauts would live with the knowledge that they are completely dependent on complex technological systems working flawlessly, with no possibility of rescue. Every unusual sound, every minor malfunction, every moment of uncertainty could trigger anxiety about potential catastrophic failures. This constant low-level stress, persisting for years, takes a tremendous psychological toll, eventually wearing down even the most resilient individuals. Communication delays with Earth would significantly amplify feelings of isolation. As the spacecraft moves farther from Earth, the time required for radio signals to travel between the two planets increases, eventually reaching up to 22 minutes each way. This means a simple question asked of Mission Control would take nearly 3/4 of an hour to receive a response. This communication delay makes normal conversation impossible and eliminates any sense of real-time connection with loved ones back home. Video calls, real-time medical consultations, or immediate technical support, all things we take for granted, would be impossible. The psychological comfort of knowing help is just a call away disappears entirely. The Earth itself plays a psychological role that's often overlooked. Astronauts on the International Space Station frequently report that seeing Earth below provides significant psychological comfort. The beautiful blue planet represents home, safety, and connection to all humanity. As a Mars-bound spacecraft moves farther from Earth, our planet would shrink to a tiny blue dot, eventually becoming just another star in the sky. This visual representation of separation can trigger profound existential responses and feelings of disconnection that psychologists call the break-off phenomenon. Privacy becomes another major psychological challenge during extended space missions. In the confined environment of a Mars spacecraft, crew members would have almost no true privacy for years. Every conversation might be overheard, every action observed. Without occasional solitude, the psychological pressure of constantly being on stage accumulates over time. Even small private spaces become psychologically vital in such environments. Yet spacecraft design constraints severely limit such accommodations. Mission planners attempt to mitigate these psychological risks through extensive screening and preparation. Astronaut candidates undergo rigorous psychological evaluation to identify those with the highest stress tolerance and interpersonal skills. Crews train together extensively before missions to build team cohesion and develop conflict resolution strategies. Spacecraft designers incorporate small touches like personal sleeping quarters, customizable lighting, and entertainment options. Psychological support protocols include regular video sessions with therapists and family members, despite the communication delay. Nevertheless, the psychological risks remain substantial. Even with careful selection and preparation, the human mind isn't designed for such extended isolation and confinement. The combination of distance from Earth, communication delays, cramped quarters, limited privacy, and constant danger creates unprecedented psychological stresses. Some experts suggest that the psychological challenges of a Mars mission may ultimately prove more difficult to overcome than the technical ones. The history of polar exploration, submarine deployments, and space station missions has taught us that human psychology can be surprisingly fragile in isolated, confined environments. While technology can solve many problems of space travel, the human mind presents unique challenges that can't simply be engineered away. As we contemplate sending humans to Mars, we must recognize that the greatest dangers may not be radiation, micrometeorites, or mechanical failures, but rather the psychological breakdown that occurs when humans are pushed beyond their evolved capacity for isolation and confinement. This psychological reality represents one of the most serious obstacles to successful human exploration of Mars. As serious as the psychological challenges are, they only become relevant if the mission can even get off the ground in the first place. The initial phase of any Mars mission represents one of its most dangerous moments, the launch from Earth and escape from our planet's gravitational pull. This critical phase requires engineering precision and raw power on a scale that pushes the boundaries of human capability. Launching a Mars mission requires rockets of unprecedented size and complexity. The spacecraft needed to sustain human life for a 3-year round trip, along with all necessary supplies, landing vehicles, habitats, and return fuel, would create a payload mass far exceeding anything we've sent to space before. The Saturn V rocket that took astronauts to the moon remains the most powerful rocket ever successfully flown. But a Mars mission would require something substantially larger. SpaceX's Starship and NASA's Space Launch System represent attempts to create this next generation of super heavy lift vehicles. But both systems are still in development phases with numerous technical challenges to overcome. The physics of rocket launches creates inherent dangers. At its core, a rocket is a controlled explosion, millions of pounds of highly combustible fuel burning in a precisely managed way to generate enough thrust to overcome Earth's gravity. The energy contained in a fully fueled Mars mission rocket would be equivalent to a small nuclear bomb. Any failure in fuel containment, engine systems, or flight controls can transform this energy into an actual explosion. The history of spaceflight is punctuated by such catastrophic failures, from the Apollo 1 fire that killed 3 astronauts during a ground test to the Challenger and Columbia space shuttle disasters. Launch precision requirements for a Mars mission leave virtually no room for error. The trajectory calculations must be perfect. A deviation of just 0.1% in the initial launch parameters could result in missing Mars by thousands of kilometers. The launch window itself presents another constraint. Due to the relative orbits of Earth and Mars, optimal launch opportunities only occur once every 26 months. Missing this window means a 2-year delay or accepting a much longer, more dangerous transit using additional fuel. This timing pressure can force difficult decisions about whether to proceed with a launch despite minor technical concerns or weather issues. During the actual launch, astronauts experience physical stresses that push human endurance to its limits. As the rocket accelerates, crew members endure forces up to 4 times normal gravity, compressing their bodies and making even breathing difficult. These G-forces can cause temporary vision impairment, difficulty moving, and in extreme cases, loss of consciousness. Medical monitoring systems would track each astronaut's vital signs during launch, ready to abort the mission if anyone showed dangerous physiological responses. The multi-stage nature of launch vehicles adds additional complexity and failure points. Each rocket stage must separate perfectly, with precise timing and clean mechanical detachment. Explosive bolts typically handle these separations, and their failure could be catastrophic, either preventing the next stage from firing or, worse, causing an uncontrolled breakup of the vehicle. Each stage separation represents a moment of extreme vulnerability for the mission. Once beyond Earth's atmosphere, the spacecraft must achieve escape velocity, a speed of about 25,000 miles per hour, to break free of Earth's gravitational pull. Achieving this velocity requires an enormous amount of energy, which is why roughly 90% of a rocket's mass at launch is fuel. The spacecraft must then perform precise engine burns to set its course for Mars, a maneuver that must be executed with exceptional accuracy. A miscalculation here could send the spacecraft into a trajectory that misses Mars entirely, dooming the crew to orbit the Sun indefinitely with no hope of rescue. The interplanetary trajectory itself presents unique hazards. Unlike missions to the International Space Station, which could return to Earth within hours if necessary, once a Mars mission commits to its interplanetary trajectory, there's no turning back. The spacecraft enters what engineers call the free return trajectory, a path that will eventually return to Earth's vicinity only after completing a full circuit around the Sun. This commitment point represents a psychological as well as physical threshold, the moment when astronauts truly leave Earth behind. Space debris presents another hazard during the early phase of the mission. Earth's orbital environment contains thousands of pieces of human-made debris, defunct satellites, spent rocket stages, and fragments from previous collisions. A collision with even a small piece of this debris, travelling at orbital velocities of 17,000 miles per hour, could puncture the spacecraft hull or damage critical systems. Mission planners must carefully plot a course that minimises these collision risks during the Earth departure phase. All these challenges explain why the launch and Earth escape phase of a Mars mission would be one of its most critical and dangerous segments. The sheer complexity, the enormous energies involved, the precision required, and the irreversible nature of the commitment all combine to make this initial phase a tremendous hurdle to overcome. Yet as daunting as these challenges are, they represent only the beginning of the journey. Even if the launch and Earth escape succeed perfectly, the crew would still face years of additional challenges before setting foot on Martian soil, assuming the spacecraft successfully launches and escapes Earth's gravity. The crew's survival would then depend entirely on the reliable operation of their life support systems throughout the long journey. These complex systems must function flawlessly for years without external maintenance or resupply, a requirement that pushes engineering reliability to its absolute limits. Life support systems for a Mars mission would need to handle several critical functions simultaneously. The most fundamental is air management, providing a breathable atmosphere by removing carbon dioxide, maintaining appropriate oxygen levels, and eliminating harmful contaminants. On Earth, our planet's natural systems handle these functions automatically, but in space, every molecule of air must be carefully managed. The system must continuously scrub exhaled carbon dioxide using limited chemical absorbers or regenerable systems, while precisely adding oxygen to maintain safe levels. A failure in either function could be rapidly fatal. Too much carbon dioxide causes headaches, confusion, and eventually unconsciousness, while oxygen levels that drop too low lead to hypoxia and death within minutes. Water management represents another critical life support function. The human body requires approximately 2 litres of water daily for drinking and food preparation. For a crew of 4 on a 3-year mission, carrying all necessary water would require about 8,760 litres, a prohibitive mass for spaceflight. Instead, Mars missions would rely on nearly perfect water recycling, capturing moisture from breath, sweat, urine, and even fecal matter, then purifying it for reuse. This recycling must achieve efficiency rates above 95% to be viable for a Mars mission. Any significant failure in water recycling would put the crew on a countdown to dehydration. Waste management presents additional challenges that directly impact life support. Human waste contains valuable water that must be recovered, but also harbours dangerous bacteria that could contaminate the closed environment of the spacecraft. Solid waste must be safely stored or processed to prevent biological and chemical contamination of the habitat. In the confined quarters of a Mars spacecraft, even minor failures in waste management systems could rapidly create unsanitary and hazardous living conditions. Temperature control represents another vital function that must operate continuously. The spacecraft's external temperature varies dramatically depending on its orientation to the Sun. Surfaces facing the Sun can reach 250 degrees Fahrenheit, while surfaces facing deep space plunge to negative 250 degrees. The life support system must maintain the internal habitat within a narrow, comfortable range despite these external extremes. This requires complex active cooling systems, heat exchangers, and insulation working in concert. A failure in temperature regulation could quickly make the habitat uninhabitable, either too hot for human survival or cold enough to cause hypothermia. The closed environment of a spacecraft creates unique challenges for air quality management. Without Earth's vast atmosphere to dilute them, trace contaminants from equipment, materials, and human activities can quickly build to dangerous levels. Everything from the glues used in construction to the fabrics in clothing slowly releases volatile compounds. the human body itself produces over 200 different volatile compounds. Life support systems must continuously filter these contaminants using limited resources. Studies from the International Space Station have shown how filters gradually lose efficiency over time, requiring replacement or regeneration, a resource challenge for a multi-year Mars mission. Microbial management presents another critical life support challenge. Humans carry billions of microorganisms on and within their bodies, and these microbes inevitably spread throughout the habitat. In Earth's open environment, this microbial shedding is inconsequential, but in the closed system of a spacecraft, certain microbes can proliferate to problematic levels. Fungal and bacterial growths can damage equipment, cause illness, and produce harmful compounds. Life support systems must control microbial populations without using harsh chemicals that might themselves become contaminants. The engineering challenge of creating reliable life support for a Mars mission cannot be overstated. Each system requires multiple redundancies and backup mechanisms, but these additional systems themselves add mass, complexity, and potential failure points. Mission designers face impossible trade-offs between reliability, redundancy, mass, and complexity. The International Space Station, our best analogue for long-duration spaceflight, requires regular resupply missions and maintenance from Earth, luxuries unavailable to a Mars-bound crew. The closed-loop nature of spacecraft life support means that problems can cascade and amplify. A minor water leak might damage electrical systems, which could compromise temperature control, which might then affect humidity levels, which could promote microbial growth, which could then contaminate air filters, creating a dangerous domino effect of cascading failures. Mission planners must anticipate these complex interactions and design systems robust enough to prevent or contain such cascades. The psychological impact of life support concerns adds another dimension to their danger. Crew members would be acutely aware that their next breath depends on machinery functioning correctly. The subtle hum of air circulators, the cycling of pumps, and the operation of filters would provide constant auditory reminders of their dependence on technology. Any unusual sound, unexpected odour, or system warning would immediately raise concerns about life support integrity. Living with this awareness for years would create a background stress that compounds the other psychological challenges of the mission. While life support systems represent a constant concern throughout a Mars mission, the spacecraft must also contend with another ever-present danger lurking in the void between planets, the threat of micrometeoroid impacts. Unlike the empty space depicted in science fiction movies, the actual space between Earth and Mars is populated with countless tiny particles, remnants of asteroid collisions, comet dust, and other cosmic debris that have been circulating in our solar system for billions of years. These micrometeoroids might seem inconsequential due to their small size. Most are no larger than a grain of sand, but their extreme velocity transforms them into serious threats. These tiny particles travel at speeds averaging 45,000 miles per hour, with some reaching velocities up to 160,000 miles per hour. At such velocities, even a particle the size of a pea carries the kinetic energy of a hand grenade. The physics of impact at these speeds means that when these particles strike a spacecraft, they don't simply puncture it like a bullet through paper, they vaporize on impact, creating an explosive plasma that can damage or penetrate the spacecraft hull. The frequency of these impacts makes them a statistical certainty for any long-duration mission. During the 7 to 8 month journey to Mars, a spacecraft would experience countless micrometeoroid strikes on its outer hull. NASA estimates that a spacecraft the size needed for a Mars mission would likely experience hundreds of impacts from particles large enough to be detected. The vast majority would be too small to cause significant damage, but each impact gradually degrades the spacecraft's protective exterior. What makes micrometeoroid impacts particularly dangerous is their unpredictability. Unlike radiation, which can be partially mitigated through shielding, or mechanical failures, which can be addressed through redundant systems, Micrometeoroid impacts can occur anywhere on the spacecraft at any time. Engineers cannot reliably predict where impacts might occur or their potential severity. This randomness means that a critical system, a fuel line, a communications antenna, or a power distribution node could be damaged despite the low overall probability of a serious impact. The most catastrophic scenario would be an impact that penetrates the crew habitat, causing rapid depressurization. The spacecraft's atmosphere would rush out through even a small breach, potentially giving the crew only minutes to identify the location of the breach and seal it before oxygen levels dropped to fatal levels. Spacecraft designs include emergency patches and sealants, but their effectiveness depends on quickly locating the breach, a challenge in a complex habitat with numerous systems and compartments. Engineers attempt to mitigate the micrometeoroid threat through various design strategies. The first line of defense is the spacecraft's micrometeoroid and orbital debris protection system, essentially sacrificial outer layers designed to absorb impacts. These typically consist of multiple thin layers separated by space. When a micrometeoroid strikes the first layer, it creates a plasma cloud that disperses through the gap, spreading the energy across a wider area of the next layer. This Whipple shield approach can effectively protect against smaller particles, but has limitations against larger impacts. Critical systems receive additional protection, often through physical placement within the spacecraft structure. Engineers design spacecraft with the most vital components, life support, primary computers, and crew quarters toward the center of the vehicle, surrounded by less critical systems and storage that provide additional shielding layers. Some designs propose using water reserves or waste storage as additional shielding around critical areas, essentially putting consumable resources to dual use. Detection systems represent another approach to micrometeoroid management. While spacecraft cannot detect individual micrometeoroids in time to maneuver away from them, they can monitor the spacecraft's exterior for damage. Pressure sensors throughout the habitat can detect even small changes that might indicate a breach, while external cameras allow crew to inspect the spacecraft's exterior for visible damage during routine maintenance. Despite these protections, the cumulative effect of micrometeoroid impacts over a multi-year mission poses a significant risk. Each impact, however minor, degrades the spacecraft's protective systems. Materials fatigue from repeated impacts, creating potential weak points. The longer the mission continues, the greater the cumulative damage becomes, and the higher the probability that a critical impact could occur. This degradation follows a statistical pattern that mission planners must account for, adding substantial safety margins to critical systems. Training for micrometeoroid emergencies forms a significant part of astronaut preparation. Crews practice rapid response to depressurization events, training to quickly don emergency oxygen supplies, locate breaches, and apply emergency patches. These drills must become second nature, as a real emergency would require immediate action without time for detailed planning or communication with Earth. The psychological stress of knowing that a random impact could occur at any moment represents yet another mental burden for Mars-bound astronauts. The micrometeoroid threat perfectly illustrates the compounding nature of risks in a Mars mission. While any single impact is unlikely to be catastrophic, the cumulative probability of a serious impact over a multi-year mission becomes significant. This statistical reality underlies all aspects of deep space mission planning. Engineers must design not just for what will probably happen, but for the full spectrum of what could happen during years in the harshest environment humans have ever attempted to traverse. As the spacecraft approaches Mars after surviving the long interplanetary journey, the crew faces what may be the most dangerous phase of the entire mission, landing on the Martian surface. This critical procedure has been aptly nicknamed the 7 Minutes of Terror by NASA engineers, referring to the approximate time from atmospheric entry to touchdown, a phase during which so many things can go catastrophically wrong that it keeps spacecraft designers awake at night. The landing challenge begins with Mars' atmospheric peculiarities. The Martian atmosphere creates a frustrating paradox for spacecraft engineers. It's too thin to provide much natural braking for a descending spacecraft, yet thick enough to generate dangerous heating and turbulence during entry. At roughly 1% the density of Earth's atmosphere, Mars provides minimal aerodynamic drag to slow a spacecraft, meaning landers must bring their own deceleration mechanisms. Yet this same atmosphere is substantial enough that a spacecraft entering it at interplanetary velocities, typically about 12,000 miles per hour, experiences extreme friction, creating temperatures that can exceed 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit on the heat shield. This atmospheric entry represents the first critical phase of landing. The spacecraft must hit the Martian atmosphere at precisely the correct angle, a narrow corridor often called the entry keyhole. If the entry angle is too steep, the spacecraft experiences excessive G-forces and heating that could destroy it. If too shallow, the spacecraft might skip off the atmosphere like a stone on water, bouncing back into space with no way to return. The acceptable entry corridor for Mars is remarkably narrow, just about 1 degree wide. A miscalculation of half a degree could mean the difference between successful landing and disaster. Once the spacecraft begins its descent through the Martian atmosphere, communication with Earth becomes impossible due to plasma blackout. The superheated gases surrounding the vehicle block radio signals, creating a communications blackout that typically lasts several minutes. During this period, the spacecraft must navigate and make critical decisions autonomously, with no possibility of intervention from mission control. This autonomy requirement introduces another layer of risk. The spacecraft's computers must function perfectly without human oversight during the most stressful phase of the mission. The thin Martian atmosphere means that conventional parachutes, while useful, cannot sufficiently slow a human-rated spacecraft to a safe landing speed. Earth landings, like those used for Apollo or Soyuz capsules, rely heavily on our planet's denser atmosphere to slow the spacecraft before touchdown. On Mars, parachutes can only reduce velocity to about 150 miles per hour, still far too fast for a safe landing. This means Mars landers must employ additional deceleration systems, typically in the form of rocket engines that fire during the final descent phase. These powered descent engines introduce their own set of risks. They must ignite perfectly after atmospheric entry and parachute deployment, providing precisely controlled thrust to decelerate the lander at the correct rate. Any engine failure during this phase would likely result in a crash with no possibility of survival. The engines must also be precisely balanced to prevent the lander from tumbling out of control during descent. The fuel for these engines must remain in perfect condition after months in space, with propellant lines free of blockages and control systems functioning flawlessly after enduring the stresses of launch, interplanetary travel, and atmospheric entry. Another significant danger during Martian landing comes from the surface itself. Mars is not the smooth, flat landscape depicted in some artistic renderings. The Martian surface is littered with rocks, craters, steep slopes, and other hazards that could destroy a landing craft on impact. Landing sites must be carefully selected based on orbital reconnaissance, but our imaging capabilities have limits. Even the best orbital cameras can't detect all potential hazards. A boulder, just a few feet tall, invisible in orbital imagery, could prove fatal if it happens to be directly under the landing site. More sophisticated human missions would require hazard avoidance systems that can identify and divert from dangerous terrain during the final descent phase, adding another layer of complexity to an already challenging procedure. Dust represents another landing hazard unique to Mars. When descent engines fire near the surface, they kick up massive dust clouds that can obscure visibility and interfere with sensor systems. This brownout condition makes it difficult for automated systems to determine altitude and velocity accurately during the final critical moments before touchdown. The dust can also infiltrate mechanical systems, potentially jamming critical components or blocking sensors. NASA's Curiosity and Perseverance rover missions employed a complex sky crane maneuver specifically to avoid this dust problem. lowering the rovers on cables while the descent stage remained at a safer height above the dust cloud. The time delay in communications between Earth and Mars creates another complication for landing operations. Depending on the relative positions of the two planets, radio signals take between 3 and 22 minutes to travel between Earth and Mars. This means that by the time Mission Control receives telemetry indicating the spacecraft has begun its descent, the craft has already either landed safely or crashed on the Martian surface. The entire landing sequence must execute automatically. With no possibility of human intervention from Earth, this automation requirement pushes the boundaries of current technology, requiring systems that can detect and respond to a wide range of potential anomalies without human guidance. For all these reasons, Mars landing represents one of the most technically challenging aspects of human Mars exploration. Null. Historical statistics underscore this difficulty. Approximately 40% of all Mars missions have failed, with landing failures accounting for many of these losses. While robotic missions can accept relatively high failure rates as part of exploration, human missions require success rates approaching 100%. Engineering such reliability into Mars landing systems represents one of the most significant technical hurdles to human exploration of the Red Planet, and explains why many experts believe the first human footprints on Mars remain decades away despite rapid advances in other areas of space technology. Even if astronauts successfully land on the Martian surface, they immediately face yet another potentially deadly challenge: the planet's notorious dust storms. Unlike the gentle dust devils occasionally captured by Mars rovers, major Martian dust storms can grow to biblical proportions, sometimes engulfing the entire planet in a reddish-brown haze that can last for months. These global dust events represent a serious threat to human exploration that cannot be easily engineered away. Mars experiences dust storm seasons that coincide with the planet's closest approach to the Sun. During these periods, localized storms can rapidly grow and combine into massive systems that dramatically transform the Martian environment. The most dramatic example occurred in 2007, when a global dust storm completely obscured the surface from orbital view for weeks. More recently, in 2018, another planet-wide dust event forced NASA's solar-powered Opportunity rover into permanent shutdown when dust blocked its solar panels for too long, depleting its batteries beyond recovery. For human explorers, these dust storms would create multiple serious hazards. The most immediate concern would be power generation. Most Mars mission architectures rely heavily on solar power, at least initially, before potential nuclear power systems could be deployed. During a global dust storm, solar energy collection can drop by 80 to 90% as the thick dust blocks sunlight from reaching the surface. A human outpost facing such reduced power generation would need to immediately implement severe conservation measures, potentially shutting down all but the most critical life support systems. Backup power sources like batteries or fuel cells would provide only limited duration emergency power, certainly not enough to wait out a storm that might last months. The dust itself poses serious mechanical threats to equipment and habitats. Martian dust is not like Earth dust. It's extraordinarily fine, with particles as small as 1 micron in diameter, allowing it to penetrate even the smallest openings in equipment and habitats. This dust has been described by scientists as having the consistency of flour, but the abrasiveness of ground glass. The particles are sharp and angular because Mars lacks the weathering processes that round off particles on Earth. This abrasive quality means the dust can damage seals, obscure optical instruments, clog filters, and wear down moving parts at an accelerated rate. What makes Martian dust particularly insidious is its electrostatically charged nature. The low humidity and constant friction in the Martian atmosphere cause dust particles to develop strong electrical charges. These charged particles are actively attracted to equipment surfaces, making them extraordinarily difficult to remove. They cling to spacesuits, solar panels, radiators, and optical equipment like a thin layer of electrically charged talcum powder. This electrostatic quality also means the dust can interfere with electronics, potentially causing short circuits or signal degradation in sensitive equipment. The chemical composition of Martian dust introduces another layer of danger. Analysis by Mars rovers has confirmed the presence of perchlorates, reactive chlorine compounds, in Martian soil at concentrations far higher than typically found on Earth. These compounds are toxic to humans, causing thyroid problems and potentially other health issues with prolonged exposure. When dust inevitably makes its way into habitats, carried in on spacesuits or through airlocks, these toxic compounds would become a persistent health concern for the crew. Filtration systems would need to work constantly to remove these particles from the habitat's air supply. Visibility presents another major operational challenge during dust storms. At their peak intensity, these storms can reduce visibility to just a few feet, making exterior operations dangerous or impossible. Astronauts caught outside during a sudden intensification of a dust storm could lose sight of their habitat or vehicles, creating potentially fatal disorientation in an environment where every direction looks identical through the haze. Navigation systems relying on visual landmarks or star tracking would become unreliable, potentially stranding crew members away from safety. The long duration of major Martian dust events creates psychological challenges as well. Imagine being confined to a small habitat for months while swirling dust obscures all exterior views and constantly rattles against the habitat walls. The constant noise, reduced power availability, limited exterior activities, and persistent worry about equipment damage would create substantial additional stress for crew members already dealing with the psychological challenges of Mars isolation. Perhaps most concerning is the unpredictable nature of these storms. While Mars has dust storm seasons, the specific timing, intensity, and duration of major events cannot be precisely predicted with current understanding. A human mission could find itself facing an unexpected global dust event at the worst possible time, perhaps during critical surface operations, habitat construction, or preparation for return to Earth. This unpredictability forces mission designers to create worst-case contingencies for all mission phases, adding substantial weight and complexity. Engineers are working on potential mitigations, including dust-resistant coatings for solar panels, electrostatic dust repulsion systems, and robust air filtration for habitats. Nuclear power sources like radioisotope thermoelectric generators or small fission reactors could provide storm-proof power, but they introduce their own safety concerns and political complications. Realistically, dust storms represent a persistent Martian hazard that future explorers will need to endure rather than eliminate, one more significant risk factor in an already precarious endeavour. As if dust storms weren't challenging enough, Mars also subjects human explorers to temperature extremes that would test even the most robust life support systems. The temperature variations on the Martian surface are far more dramatic than anything experienced in inhabited regions of Earth, creating engineering challenges that directly impact survival. A typical location on Mars might experience daytime high temperatures around 20 degrees Celsius, 68 Fahrenheit, during summer, relatively pleasant by Earth standards. However, those same locations can plummet to negative 90 degrees Celsius, negative 130 Fahrenheit, during the night or winter seasons. This 110-degree temperature swing exceeds anything regularly experienced on Earth outside of laboratory settings. What makes these variations particularly dangerous is their daily occurrence. Materials and systems must withstand this extreme thermal cycling not just occasionally, but constantly throughout a mission. These temperature fluctuations create tremendous stress on materials and equipment. All materials expand when heated and contract when cooled, but different materials do so at different rates. When components made of different materials are connected, as they inevitably are in complex equipment, these differential expansion rates create internal stresses that eventually lead to fatigue failures. Seals, joints, and connections are particularly vulnerable to this thermal cycling. A habitat that might be perfectly airtight during comfortable daytime temperatures could develop minute leaks as materials contract differently during the frigid night. The extreme cold presents particular challenges for mechanical systems. Lubricants that function perfectly at Earth-normal or warm Martian daytime temperatures can solidify at night, causing moving parts to bind or fail. Hydraulic systems face similar problems. As hydraulic fluids become more viscous or freeze entirely in extreme cold, even the electronic systems controlling critical equipment become less reliable at very low temperatures, with battery capacity significantly reduced and semiconductor performance altered. Equipment designed for Mars must either include heating systems to maintain operational temperatures or be specially engineered to function across this extreme temperature range. The human body itself is highly sensitive to temperature variations. Maintaining a habitable environment within this extreme external temperature range requires robust and redundant environmental control systems. These systems must function continuously, as even a few hours of failure during a cold Martian night could be fatal. If habitat heating systems failed completely during a winter night, internal temperatures would plummet rapidly, potentially reaching lethal levels before repairs could be completed. The energy requirements for managing these temperature extremes are substantial. During cold periods, habitats require continuous heating to maintain livable conditions. During warmer periods, heat generated by equipment and human activity must be actively removed to prevent overheating. These competing requirements create complex engineering trade-offs in system design. Power systems must be sized to handle peak heating demands during the coldest periods, while thermal radiators must be dimensioned for maximum cooling during the warmest times. This redundancy adds significant weight and complexity to Mars mission architecture. What makes Mars temperature management particularly challenging is the planet's thin atmosphere. On Earth, our relatively dense atmosphere acts as a thermal buffer, moderating temperature swings and facilitating heat transfer. Mars lacks this buffering effect, with its atmosphere about 100 times thinner than Earth's. This thin atmosphere is a poor conductor of heat, making both heating and cooling operations less efficient than they would be on Earth. Radiative heat loss to the cold Martian sky happens much more rapidly at night, while convective cooling during hot periods is less effective due to the minimal atmosphere. The combination of extreme cold and low pressure creates physical conditions that don't naturally exist on Earth, meaning that materials can behave in unexpected ways on Mars. Water ice, for example, can sublimate directly from solid to vapor without passing through a liquid phase in the Martian environment. Seals and gaskets developed for Earth applications may become brittle or lose elasticity when exposed to both cold and the near-vacuum conditions simultaneously. This unique environment means that Earth-based testing can only approximate Martian conditions, introducing uncertainty into equipment reliability predictions. Temperature management affects virtually every aspect of Mars mission operations. Spacesuits for extravehicular activities must maintain comfortable internal temperatures, while their exteriors experience both freezing shadows and broiling direct sunlight. Vehicles and equipment left outside overnight must either be designed to withstand extreme cold or include heating systems that consume precious energy resources. Scientific instruments must be calibrated to function across the temperature range or be thermally isolated from the environment, adding further complexity. The temperature extremes also impact resource utilization plans. Water, one of the most critical resources for a Mars mission, must be carefully protected from freezing and rupturing storage containers. Fuel and oxidizer components for return vehicles must be maintained within specific temperature ranges to remain usable. Even food stores can be affected by extreme temperatures, potentially altering texture, taste, and nutritional value if exposed to repeated freeze-thaw cycles. Engineers approach these thermal challenges with layered solutions. Habitats are designed with substantial insulation to reduce heat transfer. Active thermal control systems use a combination of electric heaters, heat pumps, and fluid circulation loops to move heat where it's needed. Radiators, typically large panels that dissipate excess heat into space, must be carefully designed to function efficiently in the Martian environment. Power systems are sized with substantial margins to ensure adequate heating capacity during worst-case cold scenarios. Despite these precautions, the unforgiving thermal environment of Mars remains one of the most persistent challenges to long-term human presence on the planet. Beyond the environmental challenges of temperature extremes and dust storms, the most immediate threat to human survival on Mars might be something far more mundane but equally deadly: the absence of adequate medical care. Any human mission to Mars would face severe limitations on medical capabilities that would transform otherwise treatable conditions into potentially fatal scenarios. Consider what happens during a medical emergency on Earth. When someone experiences a serious injury or sudden illness, they typically receive professional medical attention within minutes to hours, often with access to sophisticated diagnostic equipment, surgical facilities, blood products, and specialized medications. On Mars, astronauts would have nothing remotely comparable to this medical safety net. The nearest hospital would be 35 million to 250 million miles away, depending on the orbital positions of Earth and Mars, a distance that makes medical evacuation completely impossible. The medical facilities on a Mars mission would be necessarily limited by strict mass and volume constraints. Every pound of medical equipment launched to Mars comes at the expense of other mission-critical supplies. A typical Mars habitat might include a medical area roughly equivalent to a small clinic, with basic diagnostic equipment, a limited pharmacy, and perhaps capabilities for minor surgical procedures. Complex imaging technologies like MRI machines would be far too massive and power-hungry to include. Advanced surgical equipment would be severely restricted. Blood products and many medications have limited shelf lives, making them impractical for a multi-year mission. The medical personnel situation creates another critical limitation. A typical Mars mission would likely include only one or perhaps two crew members with advanced medical training, likely emergency medicine physicians cross-trained in multiple specialties. This means there would be no cardiologists for heart problems, no neurosurgeons for brain injuries, no orthopedic surgeons for complex fractures. The mission doctor would be required to function as a medical generalist, attempting to address whatever health crises might arise with limited equipment and no possibility of specialist consultation except via delayed communication with Earth. Consider how this limited medical capability would affect real-world scenarios. A ruptured appendix, a condition readily treatable on Earth with routine surgery, would become a life-threatening crisis on Mars. The mission doctor might attempt emergency surgery without proper surgical facilities, specialized instruments, or surgical assistance. Complications like excessive bleeding or infection could quickly exceed the limited treatment capabilities available. Even relatively common medical issues like kidney stones, dental emergencies, or broken bones could become serious problems due to limited diagnostic capabilities, pain management options, and treatment tools. The reduced gravity environment of Mars, approximately 38% of Earth's gravity, further complicates medical care. Surgical procedures would be challenging in reduced gravity, where blood doesn't pool normally and fluid dynamics operate differently. Healing processes for bones and tissues may be altered in reduced gravity, potentially leading to complications not seen in Earth-based medicine. The human body itself functions differently in reduced gravity, with altered cardiovascular performance, fluid distribution, and possibly different responses to medications, all factors that would complicate diagnosis and treatment. The psychological impact of limited medical capability cannot be overstated. Crew members would be acutely aware that even moderate injuries or illnesses could become life-threatening due to limited treatment options. This awareness would affect risk calculations for all activities, potentially limiting exploration and scientific operations out of medical safety concerns. The doctor on the mission would face enormous psychological pressure, knowing they are the only medical resource available and that treatment failures could result in the death of colleagues with whom they've lived in close quarters for years. Infectious disease represents another serious medical concern for a Mars mission. The closed environment of Mars habitats would allow pathogens to spread rapidly among crew members. A mission might begin with all crew members healthy, but humans naturally carry numerous microorganisms. Under the stress of spaceflight and the altered environment of Mars, normally benign microbes could potentially become pathogenic. If a serious infectious illness emerged, the limited quantity and variety of antimicrobial medications could prove insufficient, especially for drug-resistant organisms. The isolation of the Mars environment might actually accelerate the evolution of pathogens, as has been observed in similarly isolated environments on Earth. Perhaps the most sobering aspect of Mars' medical limitations is how they would affect end-of-life scenarios. If a crew member developed a terminal condition, whether from injury, illness, or complication of the Mars environment, there would be very limited palliative care options. Medications for pain management and end-of-life care would be strictly limited. The psychological impact on other crew members watching a colleague suffer with inadequate medical resources would be profound. These grim realities must be confronted in mission planning, with clear protocols established for managing terminal medical situations in an environment where traditional medical ethics may need to be reconsidered. Space agencies and aerospace companies are actively researching technologies to improve medical capabilities for deep space missions, including automated diagnostic systems, telemedicine platforms, 3D printing of medical supplies, and methods for extending medication shelf life. However, these technologies remain in early development stages, and none would fully address the fundamental limitations imposed by distance, mass constraints, and the impossibility of medical evacuation. For the foreseeable future, anyone traveling to Mars would need to accept medical risks far beyond anything experienced by humans since the early days of exploration, when voyagers set sail knowing they were beyond the reach of medical help. The medical limitations of a Mars mission are further compounded by another fundamental reality of deep space travel: the communication delay between Mars and Earth. This unavoidable physics-based constraint transforms every aspect of mission operations and creates unique challenges for crew safety and psychological well-being. The communication delay between Earth and Mars is a direct consequence of the finite speed of light, approximately 186,000 miles per second. While this seems incredibly fast, the vast distances between the planets mean that radio signals take significant time to make the journey. When Mars and Earth are at their closest approach, called opposition, the one-way communication delay is about 3 minutes. At their furthest separation, called conjunction, this delay extends to about 22 minutes. This means a simple question asked from Mars might take nearly 45 minutes to receive an answer during distant periods, 22 minutes for the signal to reach Earth, and another 22 minutes for the response to return. This delay fundamentally changes the nature of communication compared to all previous human spaceflight experiences. Even astronauts on the Moon experienced only a 1.5-second delay each way, short enough that conversations remained relatively natural. The delays to Mars eliminate any possibility of normal conversational exchange. Video calls with family would feel extremely artificial, with each participant essentially recording messages rather than having a conversation. A joke told from Earth might not receive laughter until 45 minutes later. A cry for help during an emergency might not be heard for nearly half an hour. The operational impacts of this communication delay cannot be overstated. In all previous human spaceflight, ground control could provide real-time guidance during emergencies or complex procedures. If something went wrong on an Apollo mission or on the International Space Station, experts on Earth could immediately analyze telemetry, suggest troubleshooting steps, and guide astronauts through emergency procedures. For a Mars mission, this real-time support becomes impossible. By the time ground controllers receive data indicating a problem, the situation on Mars will have evolved for many minutes, and any advice sent would address a scenario that might no longer exist by the time it's received. This communication reality forces a fundamental shift in mission operations philosophy. Mars-bound astronauts must be prepared to function with greater autonomy than any previous space travelers. They must be capable of diagnosing complex system failures, performing emergency medical procedures, and making critical decisions without real-time input from Earth experts. This requirement for autonomy drives crew selection toward individuals with exceptional problem-solving abilities and broad technical expertise rather than narrow specialization. It also necessitates more comprehensive training across multiple disciplines and extensive preparation for contingency scenarios. The communication delay also impacts the psychological support typically provided to astronauts. On the International Space Station, crew members can have real-time video conversations with psychological support personnel and family members to maintain mental health during their mission. On Mars, these conversations become disjointed exchanges of recorded messages, dramatically reducing their emotional impact and therapeutic value. The natural human connection that comes from responsive conversation is lost, potentially contributing to feelings of isolation and disconnection from Earth. Perhaps the most serious operational impact of the communication delay involves critical emergency scenarios. Imagine a rapid depressurization event in a Mars habitat. Crew members would need to locate the breach, implement emergency sealing procedures, assess damage to critical systems, and potentially evacuate to a secondary habitat, all while their oxygen supply diminishes. In such a scenario, there would be no possibility of guidance from Earth during the most critical period. By the time Earth received news of the emergency, the crew would either have resolved the immediate crisis or perished. This stark reality means that emergency procedures must be extensively rehearsed before the mission, with crews trained to respond automatically to critical situations. The communication infrastructure itself adds another layer of vulnerability. The deep space network that would maintain communication with Mars consists of large radio antennas located at 3 sites around Earth. This system has limited redundancy, and maintenance issues or equipment failures could temporarily cut communication entirely. The Mars-based communication equipment would be similarly vulnerable, with limited repair options if critical components failed. Solar flares and other space weather phenomena could further disrupt communications for hours or days. During such outages, the psychological impact of complete isolation would be profound. Mission planners work to mitigate these communication challenges through various approaches. Artificial intelligence systems might provide some level of Earth-based expertise locally on Mars, analysing problems and suggesting solutions without Earth-based input. Sophisticated automation could handle routine operations and monitor for anomalies, reducing the need for constant communication with Earth. Enhanced data compression techniques allow more information to be transmitted in each communication session, making the limited communication windows more efficient. Despite these mitigations, the fundamental physics of light speed delays cannot be overcome with current or foreseeable technology. The communication delay to Mars serves as a powerful reminder of just how far Mars truly is from Earth, not just in physical distance, but in terms of the support and connection that humans have always relied upon during exploration. It means that Mars explorers would be more truly on their own than any humans in history, forced to rely on their own capabilities and each other to a degree that fundamentally changes the nature of the endeavour. This psychological and operational reality represents yet another reason why human Mars exploration remains one of the most challenging frontiers in our solar system. While the communication challenges represent a significant obstacle, another silent but relentless threat lurks throughout a Mars mission: the continuous degradation of equipment in the harsh environment of space. Unlike technology on Earth that can be regularly maintained, repaired, or replaced when it begins to fail, spacecraft systems must function reliably for years with minimal maintenance options and no possibility of replacement deliveries. This degradation affects every system aboard the spacecraft and represents one of the most persistent dangers to mission success. The space environment subjects equipment to stresses that simply don't exist on Earth. Cosmic radiation continuously bombards electronic components, causing what engineers call single-event upsets, essentially random changes to data in computer memory or damage to semiconductor junctions in processors. Over time, this radiation exposure accumulates, gradually degrading the performance of every electronic system on the spacecraft. A computer that functions perfectly at mission start might begin experiencing increased error rates, memory failures, or complete component breakdowns after months of radiation exposure. Critical systems like life support controllers, navigation computers, and communication equipment would all experience this progressive degradation. Materials degradation represents another significant concern. Many materials commonly used in spacecraft construction, such as certain plastics, rubber seals, and composite materials, deteriorate more rapidly in the space environment. The combination of vacuum conditions and radiation causes plastics to become brittle, rubber components to harden and lose elasticity, and adhesives to weaken. Lubricants essential for moving parts can evaporate in vacuum conditions, leading to increased friction and premature mechanical failures. Even metal components can experience unexpected degradation through processes like cold welding, where metal parts in direct contact in vacuum can molecularly bond together, jamming mechanisms that worked perfectly on Earth. The extreme temperature cycles experienced during a Mars mission accelerate equipment degradation significantly. As the spacecraft changes orientation relative to the Sun, external components might cycle from positive 250 degrees Fahrenheit in direct sunlight to negative 250 degrees in shadow, often multiple times during a day. These thermal cycles cause materials to expand and contract repeatedly, creating mechanical stresses at connection points, solder joints, and structural interfaces. Over time, these stresses lead to microscopic cracks that progressively worsen until complete failure occurs. Electronics are particularly vulnerable to these thermal effects, as solder joints crack and circuit boards warp under repeated thermal stress. Vibrational stress represents another degradation factor that begins during launch but continues throughout the mission. The intense vibration experienced during launch can weaken structural components, loosen connections, and create microfractures in materials. Even after reaching space, spacecraft experience ongoing vibrational stresses from equipment like pumps, fans, and attitude control thrusters. These seemingly minor vibrations accumulate over time, gradually loosening fasteners and fatiguing materials. What might start as an imperceptible weakening can eventually progress to catastrophic failure, particularly in components under mechanical load or pressure. Micrometeoroids contribute to equipment degradation through their cumulative impact effects. Beyond the risk of a single catastrophic impact, the constant bombardment of microscopic particles progressively damages external spacecraft surfaces. Solar panels are particularly vulnerable, as their exposed surfaces gradually become pitted and scratched, reducing their efficiency over time. Thermal control surfaces like radiators also degrade under micrometeoroid bombardment, potentially compromising the spacecraft's ability to manage heat loads as the mission progresses. Even windows and optical sensors experience this gradual degradation, potentially affecting visibility and sensor performance. The maintenance challenges for Mars mission equipment would be immense. Unlike the International Space Station, which receives regular supply missions with replacement parts and new equipment, a Mars mission would need to be entirely self-sufficient for years. Every potential failure would need to be anticipated in advance, with spare parts and repair tools included in the limited payload capacity. The crew would require broad technical skills to diagnose and repair increasingly diverse equipment failures as the mission progresses. Some critical systems might be completely unrepairable in the Mars environment due to their complexity, size, dot, or the specialized tools required, creating single points of failure that could doom the entire mission. 3D printing technology offers some promise for addressing equipment degradation by allowing astronauts to manufacture replacement parts on demand. However, current space-qualified 3D printing technology has significant limitations in the materials it can use and the complexity of parts it can produce. Critical components like specialized electronics, pressure vessels, or precision mechanisms would likely remain beyond onboard manufacturing capabilities for the foreseeable future. Additionally, the 3D printers themselves would be subject to the same degradation factors as other equipment, potentially becoming unreliable just when they're most needed. The psychological impact of equipment degradation should not be underestimated. As systems begin showing signs of wear and failure rates increase, crew members would face growing anxiety about the reliability of their life support equipment. Every unusual sound, every warning light, every performance anomaly would raise questions about whether critical systems would continue functioning for the remainder of the mission. This constant low-level stress about equipment reliability would compound the other psychological challenges already facing the crew. The engineering approach to mitigating equipment degradation focuses on redundancy, overdesign, and graceful degradation paths. Critical systems would include multiple backup components, often using different designs to avoid common failure modes. Systems would be designed with performance margins far exceeding normal requirements, allowing them to continue functioning even as their capabilities degrade. Equipment would be engineered for graceful degradation, failing in predictable, manageable ways rather than catastrophically. Despite these mitigations, the fundamental reality remains that all equipment has a finite lifetime, and a Mars mission pushes that lifetime to its absolute limits. While equipment degradation threatens the technological systems supporting a Mars mission, another type of degradation presents an equally serious threat: the physical deterioration of the astronauts themselves in microgravity. The human body evolved over millions of years under the constant influence of Earth's gravity. Remove that fundamental force, as happens during the long journey between planets, and the body undergoes dramatic and potentially dangerous changes. The most immediate and well-documented effect of microgravity exposure is bone density loss. On Earth, our skeletal system constantly rebuilds itself in response to gravitational stresses. Remove those stresses, and bones begin losing calcium and weakening. Astronauts in microgravity typically lose between 1 and 2% of bone mineral density each month, more than 10 times the rate of severe osteoporosis on Earth. For a Mars mission requiring 6 to 8 months of microgravity travel each way, this could mean losing up to 15% of bone mass before even reaching Mars. This bone loss is not evenly distributed throughout the skeleton but concentrates in weight-bearing bones like the spine, hips, and legs, precisely the bones needed to support the body when gravity is encountered again on Mars. Muscle atrophy parallels this bone loss and occurs even more rapidly. Without the constant work of opposing gravity, muscles begin shrinking within days of entering microgravity. Studies from the International Space Station show that astronauts can lose up to 20% of muscle mass on flights lasting just 5 to 11 days if they don't exercise. This muscle loss affects not only the obvious large muscles of the legs and back, but also subtle stabilizing muscles that we don't consciously control. Upon arrival at Mars, this muscle degradation could leave astronauts too weak to function effectively in even the reduced Martian gravity, potentially unable to perform critical setup operations or respond to emergencies. The cardiovascular system undergoes equally profound changes in microgravity. On Earth, the heart works against gravity to pump blood up to the brain. In microgravity, this work becomes unnecessary, and the cardiovascular system begins to decondition. The heart loses muscle mass, blood volume decreases by up to 20%, and blood pressure regulation mechanisms become less effective. When gravity is encountered again, this deconditioned system struggles to maintain proper blood flow to the brain, resulting in orthostatic intolerance the tendency to become dizzy or faint when standing up. For Mars explorers, this could mean being physically incapacitated during their first crucial days on the planet when their workload would be at its highest. The immune system also functions differently in microgravity, generally showing decreased effectiveness. Studies have shown that T-cell function, cell-mediated immunity, and the body's inflammatory response all become altered during spaceflight. At the same time, microbes appear to become more virulent in microgravity environments. This combination of decreased immune function and potentially more dangerous pathogens creates a perfect storm for infectious disease risk. For a Mars mission, this could mean increased susceptibility to infections, slower wound healing, and potentially more severe illness from normally manageable diseases. Perhaps most concerning are the effects of microgravity on the brain and sensory systems. Extended microgravity exposure has been linked to vision changes through a condition called Spaceflight-Associated Neuroocular Syndrome, SANS, which includes optic nerve swelling, flattening of the eyeball, and vision changes that can become permanent. Recent research has also shown that the brain physically shifts upward in the skull during microgravity exposure, potentially compressing blood vessels and altering fluid dynamics. The long-term neurological implications of these changes remain poorly understood, but represent a serious concern for extended missions. The combined radiation exposure and microgravity effects create particularly worrying synergistic effects. Studies suggest that radiation damage to cells may be increased in microgravity conditions, while the body's natural repair mechanisms function less effectively. This combination could accelerate aging processes and increase cancer risks beyond what either factor would cause independently. For a Mars mission, this means astronauts could experience accelerated cellular aging, increased DNA damage, and potentially higher rates of cancer and degenerative diseases later in life. Current countermeasures for microgravity effects focus primarily on intensive exercise regimens. Astronauts on the International Space Station spend approximately 2 hours daily using specialized resistance and cardiovascular exercise equipment. While these protocols have shown some success in slowing deconditioning, they have not eliminated it. Even with perfect adherence, astronauts still return to Earth significantly weakened. For a Mars mission, the exercise equipment would need to be more compact yet equally effective, representing a significant engineering challenge. Other potential countermeasures include artificial gravity created by spinning all or part of the spacecraft, pharmaceutical approaches to maintain bone and muscle mass, and advanced compression garments to simulate gravitational forces on the body. However, artificial gravity systems add tremendous complexity, mass, and new failure modes to spacecraft design. Pharmaceutical approaches remain experimental and may carry their own side effects during long-duration use. The reality is that for the foreseeable future, human missions to Mars will need to accept significant physiological deconditioning as an unavoidable mission risk, one that directly impacts crew survival during critical phases like landing and initial surface operations. While the gradual degradation of the human body in microgravity presents a serious long-term concern, astronauts travelling to Mars face another threat that could prove immediately catastrophic: solar flares and extreme radiation events. Unlike the steady background radiation that permeates space, these unpredictable solar outbursts can deliver potentially lethal radiation doses within hours, transforming an otherwise successful mission into a tragedy with little warning. The Sun, despite its seemingly constant appearance from Earth, is actually a dynamic, violently active star that regularly experiences magnetic eruptions of incredible power. These eruptions take several forms, including solar flares, intense bursts of radiation across the electromagnetic spectrum, and coronal mass ejections, CMES, which hurl billions of tons of charged particles into space at speeds up to 5 million miles per hour. When these eruptions are directed toward a spacecraft, they create radiation conditions that can overwhelm even substantial shielding protections. The radiation from these solar events differs from the galactic cosmic radiation that constantly permeates space. While cosmic rays consist primarily of high-energy protons and heavier nuclei traveling at near-light speeds from sources outside our solar system, solar radiation events produce intense streams of somewhat lower-energy protons that are far more numerous. This greater particle density means solar events can deliver much higher radiation doses over shorter periods, potentially reaching acute lethal levels rather than just increasing long-term cancer risks. The timing and intensity of these solar events remain frustratingly difficult to predict with current technology. While scientists can identify active regions on the Sun that might produce eruptions, precisely forecasting when an eruption will occur and how powerful it will be remains beyond our capabilities. The Sun operates on an approximately 11-year cycle of activity, with some periods statistically more likely to produce major eruptions. But dangerous events can occur at any point in the cycle. This unpredictability means Mars-bound astronauts would need to maintain constant vigilance throughout their journey, ready to respond to a radiation emergency with minimal warning. The health effects of acute radiation exposure from a major solar event could be severe or fatal. At lower doses, radiation sickness begins with symptoms resembling severe flu, nausea, vomiting, fatigue, and fever. At higher doses, these symptoms worsen and are joined by hemorrhaging, infections from immune system collapse, and damage to the central nervous system. Extremely high doses can cause death within days or even hours. The specific threshold for these effects depends on individual factors and the rate of exposure. But a major solar event could potentially deliver radiation far exceeding survivable limits if astronauts cannot access adequate shielding quickly enough. The warning time for solar radiation events creates a particular challenge for Mars missions. Light from a solar flare reaches Earth and a Mars-bound spacecraft in just over 8 minutes, but the potentially lethal charged particles typically take anywhere from 15 minutes to several hours to arrive, depending on their energy and the specific eruption dynamics. This creates a narrow window for astronauts to reach shelter once an event is detected. Detection itself presents another challenge. A Mars spacecraft would need onboard systems capable of monitoring solar activity and providing timely alerts, as communication warnings from Earth might arrive too late due to the signal delay. Shielding against these solar radiation events represents one of the most significant design challenges for Mars mission architects. The most effective shielding materials contain high concentrations of hydrogen atoms, which can effectively absorb and disperse radiation energy. Water, being hydrogen-rich and necessary for the mission anyway, is often proposed as a dual-purpose radiation shield. Some spacecraft designs include a small, heavily shielded storm shelter where astronauts would crowd during solar events, potentially remaining for days until radiation levels subsided. This shelter might use water tanks, food stores, waste containers, and other materials strategically positioned to provide maximum protection with minimum added mass. The psychological impact of solar radiation threats adds another dimension to mission stress. Crew members would know that a major solar event could occur at any time, potentially with minimal warning. During periods of high solar activity, they might need to limit their movements to areas near radiation shelters or even preemptively enter shelters if significant activity is observed. During an actual event, they might spend days confined in a small storm shelter, unable to move freely throughout the spacecraft until radiation levels normalize. This constraint, coming on top of the already confined spacecraft environment, would further intensify the psychological pressures of the mission. Space agencies are researching technologies to improve solar radiation protection and prediction. Better forecasting models could potentially extend warning times from minutes to days by identifying precursor conditions that reliably predict eruptions. Advanced materials might provide more effective shielding with less mass penalty. Active shielding using electromagnetic fields similar to Earth's natural magnetosphere remains a theoretical possibility. though the power requirements and technical complexity have thus far prevented practical implementation for the foreseeable future. However, solar radiation events will remain one of the most serious and unpredictable threats to human Mars exploration. The impact of these radiation events extends beyond human health to affect spacecraft systems as well. The same particles that damage human tissue can cause electronic failures, corrupt computer memory, damage solar panels, and degrade materials. During major solar events, critical spacecraft systems might experience increased error rates, unexpected shutdowns, or even permanent damage. Spacecraft designed for Mars missions would require radiation-hardened electronics, redundant critical systems, and the ability to enter safe modes during extreme radiation conditions. These requirements add cost, complexity, and mass to spacecraft design, resources that are already severely constrained for interplanetary missions. Perhaps the most sobering aspect of solar radiation threats is the element of chance involved. A Mars mission might experience no significant solar events during its entire duration, or it might encounter multiple severe events. This statistical uncertainty introduces an element of luck into mission success that engineers cannot fully design around. It means that even with identical spacecraft and crew training, one mission might proceed without radiation incidents, while another might end in tragedy due simply to the random timing of solar activity. This fundamental unpredictability represents yet another reason why human Mars missions carry risks that cannot be engineered away. The threat of unpredictable solar radiation events highlights a broader challenge facing Mars missions: the fundamental limitation of resources throughout the long journey. Unlike expeditions on Earth that can potentially find food, water, or supplies along their route, or call for resupply when stocks run low, a Mars mission must carry everything needed for the entire journey or develop ways to make it along the way. This resource constraint affects every aspect of mission design and introduces vulnerabilities that have no easy solutions. The most fundamental resource constraint for a Mars mission is mass. Every pound of material sent to Mars requires fuel to launch it from Earth, accelerate it toward Mars, and safely land it on the surface. This creates a compounding problem. More supplies require more fuel, which itself requires more fuel to launch, quickly creating an exponential growth in mission size and cost. Mission planners must therefore make excruciating trade-offs between competing priorities: habitat size, food reserves, spare parts, scientific equipment, and return fuel all compete for precious payload capacity. These trade-offs directly impact crew safety, as redundant systems and emergency supplies might be reduced to meet mass constraints. Water exemplifies the resource challenges of a Mars mission. An average person requires about 2 litres of drinking water daily, plus additional water for food rehydration, hygiene, and medical needs, totaling perhaps 5 litres per person per day. For a crew of 4 on a 3-year mission, this would amount to approximately 22,000 litres of water, weighing 22 metric tons, an impossible mass to transport directly. Instead, Mars missions would rely on nearly perfect water recycling systems that capture, purify, and reuse virtually all water, including moisture from breath, sweat, urine, and even fecal water content. Even with recycling efficiencies above 95%, the system would still lose some water over time through leaks, incomplete processing, or non-recoverable uses, requiring a reserve supply to compensate for these losses. Food supplies present similar challenges. Unlike water, food cannot be efficiently recycled using current technology. A crew of 4 might require about 2.5 kilograms of food per day, totaling nearly 3,000 kilograms for a 3-year mission. This food must remain nutritionally viable and palatable throughout the mission despite radiation exposure, temperature fluctuations, and extended storage. Food systems would likely combine shelf-stable preserved foods with limited fresh foods grown in onboard gardens. These gardens, while psychologically beneficial and nutritionally valuable, would require additional resources like water, lighting, growing medium, and environmental controls, creating their own resource demands. Oxygen, another absolute necessity, presents both mass challenges and safety vulnerabilities. A 4-person crew might consume about 3.5 kilograms of oxygen daily. Carrying this directly for a 3-year mission would require nearly 4,000 kilograms. Again, prohibitively massive. Instead, missions would recycle oxygen by removing carbon dioxide from the air and then using physical chemical systems to extract the oxygen for reuse. These systems require power, replacement components, and chemical feedstocks to function continuously. Any significant failure in oxygen recycling would immediately place the crew on a countdown to suffocation, with limited emergency reserves measured in days rather than weeks or months. Energy represents another critical resource with strict limitations. While solar power can provide free energy, the intensity of sunlight at Mars is less than half that at Earth due to its greater distance from the Sun, reducing solar panel effectiveness. Dust storms can further reduce solar collection by up to 90% during global events. Nuclear power sources like radioisotope thermoelectric generators or small fission reactors could provide reliable power regardless of sunlight. But they have their own mass constraints, limited lifespans, and safety considerations. Every system on the spacecraft, from life support to communications to scientific instruments, competes for this limited energy budget, requiring careful power management throughout the mission. Spare parts and repair capabilities highlight the unforgiving nature of resource constraints in deep space. On Earth, when equipment fails, replacement parts can usually be obtained. On a Mars mission, only parts brought along would be available. Mission planners must anticipate every possible failure and include critical spares, while knowing that carrying backups for every component is impossible due to mass constraints. This creates difficult risk assessments. Which potential failures are likely enough and serious enough to justify carrying spare parts? Modern spacecraft contain millions of components, each representing a potential failure point, but might only carry thousands of spare parts due to mass limitations. The psychological dimension of resource limitations should not be underestimated. Crew members would be constantly aware of the finite nature of their supplies and the absence of resupply options. This awareness naturally creates conservation behaviours, but can also generate anxiety about resource usage. Conflicts might arise over perceived wasteful use of limited resources like water for hygiene, power for personal entertainment, or food preferences. Mission planners typically include margins in critical consumables, but these margins are much smaller than would be considered comfortable in terrestrial settings, creating persistent background stress about resource adequacy. Resource limitations create cascading vulnerabilities throughout a Mars mission architecture. A failure in one system often increases demand on other limited resources. For example, a water leak might increase demand on purification systems, which requires more power, which stresses power generation systems, which might reduce power available for other critical functions. This interdependence means that resource management becomes increasingly challenging as mission duration extends, with small initial problems potentially growing into serious resource crises if not addressed early and effectively. The unforgiving mathematics of deep space resource limitations explains why many experts believe that developing resource utilization technologies, the ability to extract water, oxygen, and building materials from Martian soil and atmosphere represents an absolute prerequisite for sustainable human presence on Mars. The resource limitations of a Mars mission would be challenging enough if the Martian environment itself were benign. But the reality presents yet another deadly complication: the toxic nature of Martian soil itself. Unlike the relatively hospitable dirt of Earth, Mars soil contains chemical compounds that pose serious health risks to human explorers and create significant operational challenges for any long-term presence on the Red Planet. The most concerning components of Martian soil are perchlorates, chlorine-based compounds that have been detected at surprisingly high concentrations across different Martian landing sites. NASA's Phoenix lander, Curiosity rover, and subsequent missions have confirmed perchlorate levels in Martian soil at approximately 0.5 to 1% by weight, concentrations hundreds of times higher than typical Earth soils. These compounds likely formed through long-term interaction between Martian surface minerals and ultraviolet radiation from the Sun, accumulating over billions of years in the absence of natural processes that would break them down. Perchlorates pose multiple health risks to humans on Earth. These compounds are known to interfere with iodine uptake in the thyroid gland, potentially causing hormonal imbalances with long-term exposure. They're particularly problematic for pregnant women and developing fetuses, potentially causing developmental issues. Beyond thyroid effects, perchlorates can impair lung function when inhaled as dust, potentially causing or exacerbating respiratory conditions. They've also been linked to issues with the nervous system and reproductive health in high enough concentrations. For astronauts already dealing with the physiological stresses of spaceflight and reduced gravity, these additional health impacts could seriously compromise mission success. The physical nature of Martian soil compounds these toxicity concerns. Mars dust is extraordinarily fine, with particles often smaller than 1 micron in diameter, making them small enough to bypass the body's natural filtration systems when inhaled. These microscopic particles could penetrate deep into the lungs, carrying perchlorate compounds and other potentially harmful substances directly into the respiratory system. The ultrafine dust would be nearly impossible to completely exclude from habitats and spacesuits over a long-duration mission, creating unavoidable exposure pathways. Beyond perchlorates, Mars soil contains other potentially hazardous components. The soil is highly oxidizing, meaning it readily reacts with organic compounds due to compounds formed by interaction with the planet's radiation environment. These oxidants would react with biological tissues upon contact, potentially causing skin irritation, eye damage, or respiratory inflammation. Some studies suggest Martian soil simulants can cause cellular damage similar to that from asbestos exposure, raising concerns about long-term pulmonary health impacts for astronauts repeatedly exposed to the dust. The practical implications of soil toxicity would affect virtually every aspect of Mars surface operations. Spacesuits would need specialized systems to prevent dust infiltration around seals and joints, along with decontamination procedures before re-entering habitats. Habitats themselves would require sophisticated airlocks and filtration systems to minimize dust entry, along with cleaning protocols to manage inevitable contamination. Scientific and maintenance activities would need to balance operational needs against exposure risks, potentially limiting exterior activities during certain conditions or requiring additional protective measures. Dust contamination of mechanical systems represents another serious concern related to Martian soil. The fine, abrasive dust would infiltrate bearings, seals, hinges, electrical connections, and other critical components, accelerating wear and potentially causing premature failures. The reactive nature of the soil compounds would further accelerate corrosion of metal components and degradation of polymers, particularly when combined with temperature cycles and humidity inside habitats. Equipment designed for Mars would need extensive dust protection features, adding complexity and potential failure points to already sophisticated systems. Water extraction, a likely necessity for long-term Mars missions, would be complicated by soil toxicity issues. Most water utilization plans involve processing Martian soil to extract water ice or chemically bound water. But this process would also concentrate soil contaminants like perchlorates. Water purification systems would need additional capabilities to remove these compounds before human use, adding complexity to already resource-intensive processes. The potential for perchlorate contamination of water supplies would require rigorous and continuous monitoring to ensure crew safety. agricultural efforts in Martian soil present particular challenges due to its toxic components. Plants grown in perchlorate-rich soil can absorb and concentrate these compounds, making them potentially unsafe for human consumption. Any Martian greenhouse would require either extensive soil treatment to remove harmful compounds or the use of completely isolated hydroponic systems using purified water. The potential for dust contamination of growing areas would require careful environmental controls to prevent toxins from entering the food chain. Some researchers have suggested potential benefits to the perchlorate-rich Martian soil. These compounds could potentially be harvested as a resource. Perchlorates are powerful oxidizers used in rocket propellants, explosives, and other industrial applications. With appropriate processing, Mars soil might provide materials for propellant production to support return missions or further exploration. Additionally, the same chemical properties that make perchlorates hazardous could potentially be harnessed for sterilization or water purification applications if properly controlled. Despite these possible benefits, the primary impact of Martian soil chemistry remains a serious health and operational hazard that adds another layer of complexity to an already challenging endeavor. The toxic nature of Martian soil represents a perfect example of how Mars exploration challenges extend far beyond the obvious issues of distance and radiation. Even the ground beneath astronauts' feet would present constant hazards requiring vigilant management and sophisticated countermeasures. While not immediately lethal like vacuum exposure or radiation poisoning, the cumulative effects of soil toxicity could gradually undermine crew health and equipment functionality throughout a mission, potentially contributing to cascading failures that could ultimately prove fatal. Mission planners must develop comprehensive protocols for managing this persistent environmental hazard, one that, unlike radiation or temperature, cannot be escaped anywhere on the Martian surface, beyond the toxic soil. Another fundamental aspect of the Martian environment poses perhaps the most immediate threat to human survival: the planet's atmospheric pressure, or more accurately, period, its near absence. Mars possesses an atmosphere so thin that it creates conditions almost as hostile as the vacuum of space itself, requiring elaborate protection systems just to survive and presenting unique challenges unlike anything encountered on Earth. The atmospheric pressure on Mars averages about 0.6% of Earth's sea level pressure, equivalent to what you would experience at roughly 20 miles above Earth's surface, well above the altitude where commercial aircraft fly. This extreme low pressure has immediate physiological implications for humans. Without pressure suits, human blood would begin to boil at body temperature. Gases dissolved in body tissues would expand rapidly, and unconsciousness would occur within seconds, followed by death within minutes. This makes the pressure difference alone immediately life-threatening, even before considering oxygen requirements or temperature concerns. This pressure differential creates enormous engineering challenges for habitat design. Mars habitats must maintain internal pressure approximately equal to Earth's atmosphere while surrounded by the near vacuum of Mars. This pressure difference, roughly 14 pounds per square inch, means that a typical habitat module would experience tons of outward force on its structure, essentially functioning as a pressure vessel similar to a spacecraft. Any weakness in seals, windows, airlocks, or structural elements could lead to rapid decompression events. Unlike underwater pressure vessels that experience external pressure, these habitats would be constantly strained outward, making any breach potentially catastrophic as the higher pressure interior atmosphere rushes toward the near vacuum outside. Airlocks become particularly critical and vulnerable components in this environment. Every exit from a habitat for exterior activities requires cycling through an airlock, a small chamber that can be depressurized and repressurized to allow passage without compromising the main habitat atmosphere. Each airlock cycle loses some atmosphere to the Martian environment, gradually depleting a precious resource that must be continuously regenerated. Airlocks also represent potential failure points where seals must maintain perfect function despite repeated pressure cycles and inevitable dust contamination. A failure of airlock seals could result in rapid habitat depressurization, potentially giving occupants just minutes to don emergency pressure suits before losing consciousness. Spacesuits for Martian surface operations face similar challenges. Unlike spacesuits used in Earth orbit, Mars suits must withstand not only the pressure differential, but also surface conditions including dust, temperature extremes, and radiation while providing sufficient mobility for productive work. The pressure differential alone creates a fundamental design challenge. Higher internal pressure makes suits stiffer and less flexible. Yet lower pressure requires astronauts to breathe higher oxygen concentrations, increasing fire risks. Current spacesuit designs represent difficult compromises between mobility, protection, and operational duration, typically limiting astronauts to 6 to 8 hours of exterior activity before requiring return to the habitat for suit maintenance and physiological recovery. Structural integrity of pressure vessels becomes an overriding safety concern in the Martian environment. Any habitat component, windows, doors, walls, connection points, utility pass-throughs, must maintain perfect pressure sealing for years without failure. Even microscopic cracks can grow over time as materials fatigue under constant stress, potentially leading to catastrophic failures. Habitats would require continuous monitoring for pressure drops that might indicate developing leaks, along with emergency repair capabilities for addressing breaches. The potential for micrometeoroid impacts, equipment accidents, or material fatigue creates a persistent background risk that can never be completely eliminated. The physiological impacts of pressure differentials extend beyond the obvious catastrophic decompression scenarios. Repeated transitions between pressurized habitats and pressure suits can cause decompression sickness, commonly known as the bends, similar to what divers experience when ascending too quickly. Gas bubbles can form in tissues and bloodstream during pressure transitions, potentially causing pain, neurological symptoms, or even life-threatening complications. Mars mission protocols would need to include carefully planned compression and decompression procedures for all extravehicular activities, potentially including pre-breathing regimens to wash nitrogen from the bloodstream before pressure changes. Long-term habitat pressure management presents additional challenges. All pressurized environments experience some degree of leakage through microscopic pathways around seals, through material permeation, and via airlocks on the International Space Station. This leakage requires regular resupply of atmospheric gases from Earth. On Mars, replacement gases would need to be either brought from Earth at great expense or manufactured from Martian resources using energy-intensive processes. Either approach introduces potential resource limitations that could become critical over a multi-year mission. Systems for detecting, locating, and repairing even small leaks would be essential for long-term habitat viability. Emergency response procedures for pressure-related emergencies would need to be extensively rehearsed by Mars crews. Unlike fire or medical emergencies on Earth where external assistance might be available, pressure emergencies on Mars would require immediate autonomous response with the equipment and personnel immediately at hand. Crew members would need to quickly locate breaches, apply emergency patches, isolate compromised compartments, and assist anyone unable to reach emergency pressure suits in time. The speed required for effective response, with potential survival times measured in minutes or even seconds, means these procedures would need to become completely automatic through repetitive training. The constant physiological danger presented by Mars' minimal atmosphere represents one of the most immediate threats to astronaut survival. Unlike many other Mars hazards that present long-term risks or statistical probabilities, atmospheric pressure is an immediate, constant concern that cannot be escaped anywhere on the Martian surface. Every moment spent on Mars would require either a pressurized habitat or pressure suit as an absolute barrier between life and death, with no natural resources or emergency measures available if these engineered systems fail. This fundamental hostility of the basic Martian environment explains why sustained human presence on Mars remains one of humanity's most challenging technical frontiers. All the dangers of the Martian environment would be difficult enough to endure even if Mars were a final destination. But most mission architectures envision something even more challenging: a return journey to Earth. The return phase of a Mars mission may actually present more complex technical challenges than the outbound journey, creating another set of potentially fatal scenarios that astronauts would need to overcome to make it home safely. The most fundamental challenge of Earth return begins with leaving the Martian surface. Unlike Earth, with its extensive launch infrastructure, manufacturing capabilities, and support personnel, Mars offers nothing but the equipment and supplies brought along on the initial journey. A Mars ascent vehicle would need to launch from an unprepared surface with no launch pad, no fueling infrastructure, no weather monitoring systems, and no army of technicians to address last-minute issues. The entire launch process would depend on equipment that had been sitting in the harsh Martian environment for over a year, potentially degraded by dust, radiation, and temperature cycles. The propulsion requirements for Mars ascent create another massive challenge. Launching from Mars requires less energy than launching from Earth due to the lower gravity, but still demands significant propellant. Mission architects face a brutal choice: either bring the return propellant from Earth, more dramatically increasing the initial mission mass, or manufacture the propellant on Mars using local resources. Both approaches have serious drawbacks. Bringing the propellant means it must survive the outbound journey, landing forces, and over a year of storage on the Martian surface without leaking, freezing, or chemically degrading. Manufacturing propellant on Mars, while mass efficient, requires complex chemical processing equipment, energy sources, and time, all while creating multiple additional failure points where a single problem could strand the crew permanently. Most current return mission concepts focus on in situ resource utilization, specifically producing methane fuel and oxygen oxidizer from Martian carbon dioxide and water ice. This process requires multiple steps: harvesting carbon dioxide from the thin atmosphere, extracting water from subsurface ice deposits, electrolyzing the water to produce oxygen, and then combining the hydrogen with carbon dioxide through the Sabatier reaction to produce methane and more water. Each step requires energy, specialized equipment, and time, with the entire production process taking months of continuous operation. Any significant equipment failure during this critical production phase could make return impossible. Once the ascent vehicle successfully reaches Martian orbit, the mission faces the challenge of orbital rendezvous with a return habitat that has been waiting in Mars orbit. This precisely choreographed orbital meeting requires functioning guidance systems, accurate navigational capabilities, and sufficient propellant reserves for maneuvering. Unlike orbital rendezvous around Earth, where ground control can provide detailed tracking and guidance, Mars orbital operations would be largely autonomous due to communication delays. A failure during this phase could result in the ascent vehicle being unable to dock with the return habitat, leaving the crew with no viable path home. The return journey itself presents unique challenges beyond those of the outbound trip. The spacecraft would be older, with systems that have already experienced significant operational time and radiation exposure. The crew would be physiologically weaker after extended time in reduced gravity. Resource margins would be thinner, with less redundancy available if critical systems began to fail. The psychological pressure would be immense, having survived years on Mars. Crew members would be acutely aware that they were still only halfway through their journey, with many potential failure points remaining before reaching Earth. Earth re-entry creates another set of unique challenges. A spacecraft returning from Mars would hit Earth's atmosphere at much higher velocities than vehicles returning from the Moon or Earth orbit. This increased velocity translates to significantly higher heating during re-entry, requiring more robust thermal protection systems that must function perfectly after years in space. The G-forces experienced during this high-speed re-entry would place enormous physiological stress on crew members already weakened by years in reduced gravity, potentially causing blackouts or worse if anyone's cardiovascular system couldn't withstand the strain. The return trajectory to Earth has even narrower launch windows than the outbound Mars journey. Missing these windows could force the spacecraft to remain in orbit around the Sun for nearly 2 years before another Earth intercept opportunity becomes available. This creates enormous time pressure on all return preparation activities, potentially forcing mission controllers to accept higher risks rather than delay departure and miss the narrow return window. The alternative, spending an additional Martian year waiting for the next window, would stretch life support resources and increase radiation exposure beyond planned mission parameters. Perhaps the most sobering aspect of the return challenge is the complete absence of rescue options. If a serious problem develops during Earth return, whether a propulsion failure, life support degradation, or medical emergency, no rescue mission could possibly reach the crew in time. The spacecraft would either have to complete its return with the problem unresolved or face the unthinkable scenario of the crew perishing within communication range of Earth but beyond any possible assistance. This stark reality would weigh heavily on both the crew and mission controllers throughout the return phase. All these challenges explain why many experts consider the Earth return portion of a Mars mission to potentially be its riskiest phase. The combination of aged equipment, physically compromised crew members, limited resources, narrow launch windows, and high-energy re-entry creates multiple opportunities for mission-ending failures. Yet the alternatives, either remaining permanently on Mars or implementing one-way mission architectures, present their own ethical and practical challenges that mission planners are reluctant to embrace. The return journey remains an essential but extraordinarily difficult component of human Mars exploration, representing yet another reason why reaching Mars and returning safely requires overcoming challenges beyond anything attempted in previous space exploration. While the technical challenges of Mars missions are formidable, perhaps equally significant are the psychological effects that would impact crew members, particularly a phenomenon space psychologists call the Earth vision effect. The profound psychological impact of seeing our home planet reduced to a mere point of light in the black void of space. This experience, unique to deep space missions, creates psychological stresses unlike anything encountered in previous human exploration. Throughout human history, even during the most daring explorations, people maintained some visual connection to familiar environments. Early ocean explorers could still see the sky, stars, dot, and water that connected them to their known world. Even astronauts in Earth orbit or on the Moon still see our planet as a large, recognizable sphere, a constant visual reminder of home that provides psychological grounding. On a Mars mission, however, this fundamental connection would be severed as Earth gradually shrinks to nothing more than a bright star in the spacecraft window. This visual reality of Earth's diminishment creates a psychological separation that can trigger profound existential responses. Astronauts who have travelled to the Moon, still relatively close to Earth, have already reported significant psychological impacts from seeing our planet from afar. Apollo astronaut Edgar Mitchell described experiencing a profound sense of universal connectedness viewing Earth from lunar distance, while others reported new appreciation for Earth's fragility and uniqueness. These experiences occurred while still seeing Earth as a substantial visible disk. For Mars-bound astronauts, watching Earth shrink until it becomes just another point of light would likely intensify these responses, potentially triggering what psychologists call the overview effect in its most extreme form, a complete shift in perception about humanity's place in the cosmos. This physical separation becomes particularly significant because it corresponds to an equally real operational separation. From Mars distances, crew members would know that no emergency return is possible. No rescue mission could reach them in time, and even communication requires significant delays. This combination of visual disconnection and actual physical isolation creates a psychological reality unlike anything previously experienced, a sense of being truly cut off from humanity with no immediate way back. Studies of isolated groups in Antarctic research stations have shown that the mere knowledge that emergency evacuation is possible provides significant psychological comfort, even if rarely used. Mars astronauts would lack even this psychological safety net. The contrast between Earth memories and Martian reality would further amplify psychological stress. Earth represents an environment of abundance, breathable air, flowing water, diverse life, and natural beauty. Mars offers none of these comforts, presenting instead a harsh, barren landscape through habitat windows or spacesuit visors. The constant visual reminder of Mars's desolation, combined with the absence of Earth's visible presence, could intensify feelings of isolation and longing for terrestrial comforts. Even simple sensory experiences taken for granted on Earth, the smell of rain, the sound of birds, the feeling of wind, would be completely absent, replaced by the artificial environment of spacecraft and habitats. The permanence of the Earth vision effect throughout a Mars mission creates particular challenges. Unlike other mission stressors that might come and go, the visual reality of Earth's distance would remain constant for years, with Earth only growing from a star-like point to a tiny disk during the final approach to home. This persistent reminder of separation means that any psychological responses couldn't simply be weathered as temporary challenges, but would need to be managed as ongoing conditions throughout the mission. Some astronauts might adapt successfully to this new perception, while others might experience persistent homesickness, depression, or existential distress that could impact their performance and health. Space agencies have recognized the potential psychological impact of extreme isolation and are researching countermeasures. Virtual reality systems might provide immersive, Earth-like environments that could temporarily alleviate the sensory deprivation of spacecraft and Martian habitats. Communication protocols could emphasize connection with family and friends despite delays, perhaps through recorded messages or shared virtual experiences. Crew selection would heavily emphasize psychological resilience, choosing individuals who demonstrate positive adaptation to isolation in analog environments like Antarctic winterovers or extended underwater missions. Onboard activities would be designed to provide meaningful work and leisure that creates purpose beyond the constant reality of separation. What makes the Earth vision effect particularly challenging is that it represents a fundamentally new human experience with limited analogues in previous exploration. The closest historical comparisons might be early polar explorers who wintered over in Antarctica, cut off from communication and return possibilities for months, but even they knew their isolation was temporary and seasonal. The combination of extreme distance, visual disconnection, multi-year duration, and the impossibility of emergency return creates psychological territory as unexplored as Mars itself. Initial Mars crews would be venturing into this psychological unknown alongside the physical journey, potentially experiencing reactions that couldn't be fully predicted despite extensive preparation and screening. The Earth vision effect also extends beyond individual psychology to affect crew dynamics. When all crew members share the same profound disconnection from Earth, it could either strengthen group cohesion through shared experience or amplify conflicts if individuals process the isolation differently. The crew would become each other's entire social world for years, intensifying both positive and negative interactions. Unlike International Space Station crews who can look out the window and see their homes orbiting below, Mars crews would be entirely dependent on each other for human connection, with Earth-based psychological support limited by communication delays and the planet's physical absence from their visible universe. The psychological reality of seeing Earth reduced to a distant point of light represents one of the most profound and uniquely challenging aspects of human Mars exploration. While most mission risks involve potential physical harm, the Earth vision effect impacts the fundamental human experience of connection, belonging, and place. Managing these psychological responses throughout a multi-year mission represents a challenge perhaps equal to the formidable technical obstacles of Mars travel, a reminder that sending humans to Mars isn't merely about solving engineering problems, but about preparing people to thrive in an environment more psychologically alien than any previously encountered in our species' long history of exploration. Beyond the profound psychological challenges posed by extreme isolation, a Mars mission faces another fundamental vulnerability that underlies virtually every aspect of the endeavour: the complex web of technological interdependencies that must function flawlessly for years with minimal maintenance options. This intricate technological ecosystem represents one of the most significant barriers to successful Mars exploration and explains why the margin for error is so extraordinarily thin. A human Mars mission would represent the most complex technological system ever deployed away from Earth. Consider the sheer number of components involved. A typical mission architecture might include propulsion systems, life support equipment, power generation, thermal management, communication arrays, navigation systems, habitats, airlocks, spacesuits, rovers, scientific instruments, medical equipment, food production facilities, and countless subsystems supporting each of these functions. Each major system contains thousands to millions of individual components, electronic parts, mechanical elements, software modules, and structural materials, all of which must function together seamlessly. The scale of this complexity becomes apparent when considering the statistics. A modern spacecraft typically contains more than 2 million individual parts. The International Space Station, our closest analogue to a Mars habitat, includes over 50 computer systems running more than 8 million lines of code, controlling thousands of individual components. A Mars mission would require similarly complex systems, but with far less opportunity for maintenance, replacement, or external support when failures occur. What makes this complexity particularly dangerous is the interconnected nature of these systems. Life support depends on power systems, which rely on thermal management, which requires functioning computers, which need stable communication protocols, creating chains of dependencies where failure in one area cascades to others. Engineers call these coupled systems because a problem in one domain rapidly affects others in ways that can be difficult to predict or contain. For example, a seemingly minor cooling system issue might cause electronics to overheat, leading to computer failures, which then impact environmental controls, potentially creating life-threatening conditions within hours if not addressed. Software adds another dimension of complexity and potential failure modes. A Mars spacecraft would run millions of lines of code controlling everything from life support to navigation. Software errors have caused mission failures even in much simpler spacecraft, like the Mars Climate Orbiter, lost due to a simple unit conversion error in its navigation software. As systems become more sophisticated, the potential for subtle software interactions and unforeseen error conditions grows exponentially. The challenge is particularly acute for autonomous systems that must make decisions without human input due to communication delays. These require software robust enough to handle unforeseen scenarios while making literally life or death decisions. Redundancy, building backup systems for critical functions, represents the traditional approach to managing technological vulnerabilities in spacecraft. However, redundancy creates its own challenges for a Mars mission. Each backup system adds mass, power requirements, and maintenance needs to an already resource-constrained mission. Designers face impossible trade-offs between adding redundancies for safety versus keeping the mission lightweight enough to be feasible. Even with redundant systems, some failure modes can bypass or disable both primary and backup systems simultaneously, particularly those related to common causes like radiation events, power failures, or design flaws that affect all versions of a system. The Christmas light problem illustrates another aspect of technological vulnerability in complex systems. In old-style Christmas lights, when one bulb failed, the entire string went dark, because the circuit was connected in series. Similarly, in spacecraft systems, critical functional chains often have weak links where a single component failure can disable much larger systems. Engineers work to eliminate these single points of failure, but mass and complexity constraints make some level of vulnerability inevitable. For a Mars mission lasting years, the statistical probability of encountering critical component failures becomes significant regardless of design redundancy. Maintenance capabilities represent another crucial limitation. On Earth, complex technological systems require regular maintenance by specialists with access to replacement parts, diagnostic equipment, and specialized tools. On Mars, the crew would have limited spare parts, constrained tool sets, and might lack the specialized expertise to address certain failures. Even with extensive cross-training, no small crew could realistically maintain expert-level knowledge across the dozens of complex systems comprising a Mars mission. Remote guidance from Earth experts would help, but would be hampered by communication delays and limited diagnostic capabilities. Technology dependencies extend to the information realm as well. Astronauts would rely on complex databases for procedures, scientific information, medical knowledge, and technical specifications, all stored in computer systems vulnerable to the same environmental hazards as other electronics. While critical information would have physical backups, the sheer volume of technical data necessary for the mission would make complete non-electronic redundancy impractical. A serious computer system failure could leave the crew without access to crucial information precisely when they need it most to address emergencies. The time dimension of technological dependencies creates another challenge. Early failures might be manageable with ample spare parts and fresh crew skills, but as the mission progresses, resources would deplete and fatigue would accumulate. A technical problem occurring 2 years into the mission would face a very different response capability than one happening during initial operations. This degrading capacity to address failures over time creates a negative reliability curve that is difficult to fully account for in mission planning. Technology evolution presents a paradoxical challenge as well. The extended development time for Mars missions means that some systems might be partially obsolete even before launch, as newer technologies emerge during the years-long development process. However, newer technologies lack the extensive testing and operational history that builds confidence in reliability. Mission designers must constantly balance proven but aging technology against newer capabilities that might offer advantages but carry unknown risks, another impossible trade-off with life or death consequences. The reality of these complex technological dependencies explains why even apparently simple tasks become extraordinarily difficult in deep space missions. Activities that would be trivial on Earth, replacing a broken valve, updating a computer system, or diagnosing an unusual noise, become major operational challenges when conducted millions of miles from home with limited resources and expertise. Each technological system added to the mission creates not just its own failure modes, but new interaction effects with existing systems, rapidly multiplying the total risk profile in ways that can never be fully tested or simulated before the mission begins. Even with perfectly designed technological systems, Mars missions would face one final, perhaps most significant vulnerability: the potential for human error in critical situations. The history of spaceflight demonstrates that even the most highly trained astronauts and mission controllers remain fallible humans, capable of mistakes that can have catastrophic consequences in the unforgiving environment of space. On a Mars mission, these normal human limitations would be amplified by extreme conditions that push cognitive and psychological capacities to their absolute limits. The physical environment of a Mars mission would create perfect conditions for human performance degradation. Extended exposure to microgravity and radiation causes fatigue, sleep disturbances, and potentially subtle cognitive impairment. Confinement in small habitats for years leads to chronic stress and attention deficits. The constant background noise of life support equipment disrupts sleep quality. The altered day-night cycles of Mars, with days slightly longer than Earth's, disrupt circadian rhythms. Even nutrition can become compromised on long missions as food palatability decreases and dietary variety diminishes. Each of these factors incrementally degrades human performance, increasing the probability of errors during critical operations. Psychological stressors further compromise decision-making capabilities. The isolation, confinement, and distance from Earth discussed earlier create chronic stress that affects cognitive function. Studies in analog environments like Antarctic winter overstations show that after months in isolation, personnel experience what psychologists call winter over syndrome, characterized by impaired cognition, memory problems, difficulty concentrating, and increased irritability. For Mars astronauts, these effects would likely be more pronounced due to the greater isolation and higher stakes. When chronically stressed individuals must make complex decisions with incomplete information, exactly the scenario in many space emergencies, error rates increase significantly. The time pressure of emergencies creates another dimension of human vulnerability. Many spacecraft emergencies develop rapidly, requiring immediate response before conditions deteriorate beyond recovery. A habitat breach, fire, or life support failure might give the crew only minutes to diagnose the problem and implement corrective actions. Under such time pressure, humans naturally default to cognitive shortcuts, focusing on familiar patterns rather than fully analysing the situation. This can lead to fixation errors, where the crew becomes convinced of an incorrect diagnosis and pursues the wrong solution while valuable response time ticks away. Training helps mitigate these tendencies but cannot eliminate them, particularly when crew members are fatigued or stressed. Group dynamics introduce additional complexity to error potential. Even small crews develop social hierarchies that can inhibit communication during emergencies. Junior crew members might hesitate to contradict a commander's assessment, even when they notice discrepancies. Cultural differences in communication styles, likely in international missions, can lead to misunderstandings during time-critical situations. The confined environment amplifies interpersonal tensions that might have been manageable in normal circumstances. Studies of isolated groups show that team cohesion typically deteriorates over time in confined settings, potentially compromising the collaborative decision-making essential during emergencies. The absence of external perspectives creates another error vulnerability unique to deep space missions. On Earth or in Earth orbit, mission controllers provide a separate cognitive resource, people who are not experiencing the same stresses as the crew and who can bring fresh perspectives to problem solving. On a Mars mission, the communication delay eliminates this real-time external input during emergencies. The crew becomes their own and only immediate resource for critical thinking, lacking the second opinion that has saved numerous missions in the past when both crew and controllers contributed to solutions. Training for emergency scenarios, while essential, faces fundamental limitations for Mars missions. It's simply impossible to train for every potential emergency in a multi-year, multi-system mission. The combinatorial explosion of possible failure modes, especially when systems interact in unexpected ways, means crews will inevitably face scenarios they never specifically practiced. This requires transitioning from procedure-based responses to principle-based problem-solving under the worst possible conditions of stress, fatigue, and limited resources. Even the most extensive training cannot fully prepare crews for this challenge. The continuous nature of a Mars mission creates another human factor risk through habituation to danger. When people live with potential hazards continuously, they gradually become desensitized to warning signs. Safety procedures that are rigorously followed early in the mission might be abbreviated or skipped entirely as time passes. This phenomenon, well documented in high-risk professions on Earth, becomes even more pronounced in isolated environments where external oversight is absent. The very experience and confidence gained through successful operations paradoxically increases vulnerability to errors through reduced vigilance. Perhaps most concerning is how these human factor risks compound over time and interact with the technical vulnerabilities discussed earlier. Human errors rarely occur in isolation. They typically happen when multiple factors align. A technical system behaving unexpectedly, a fatigued operator, time pressure, incomplete information, and social dynamics that inhibit optimal response. A Mars mission would create the perfect environment for these factors to converge repeatedly over years of operation. Each day would bring statistical opportunities for human error, and in an environment with no margin for serious mistakes, even a single significant error could prove catastrophic. These human factor challenges explain why many experts consider the psychological and performance aspects of a Mars mission to be as limiting as the technical challenges. The mission would require not just extraordinary technology, but extraordinary humans, people capable of maintaining high performance, sound judgment, and effective teamwork under conditions designed to undermine all three. The combination of technological complexity and human vulnerability creates a risk profile unlike anything in previous exploration efforts, helping explain why the journey to Mars remains aspirational despite decades of technological progress. The Red Planet continues to offer a tantalizing destination for human exploration, but the path there remains strewn with challenges that technology alone cannot solve.